It's 7:03, and I'm in downtown San Diego and heading toward the harbor. So we'll take a look at that, and we're passing by the train station where I came in yesterday. So what we're going to talk about today is a variety of factors. We're going to talk about drug addiction and how that's related to obesity, and we're going to talk about the recent research studies that show different parts of the brain, and particularly something called the dopaminergic pathway, the high or the hit pathway in the brain, so that when you get a rush, so hit, rush, sudden burst of pleasure, that goes through some pathways in the brain, which we now know in mice and people and animals. And we'll talk about that, and narcotics, alcohol, cocaine, cigarettes, things like that, and how they affect the pathways in the brain, and what that has to do with obesity. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the disconnect between telling you what to do and then you knowing what to do and then you not doing it. So in other words, a lot of the things I tell people, like eat healthy food, they already know. So I'm worthless. Because most people already know they're supposed to eat healthy food, not eat ice cream and candy. So that's not really useful. That's not very helpful to them. On the other hand, the tool that we're going to talk about this morning is an understanding of why they know things but don't do things. And so what we'll do is discuss why there's that disconnect, and then we're going to talk about how to battle that disconnect. So that's our plan for this morning. I'm walking against the light. Okay, so we're coming up. I'm going to take a brief break, and I'm going to show you the harbor once I get to it, so about a block away. So it's going to take a while. This will take about probably 30 to 60 minutes, but I think you'll find it useful. When I talk to patients about these topics, most of the things I'm going to talk about this morning, people don't understand. So, there's a few people showing up. Good morning, Vanessa and Sarah. One's a new friend, and one's I don't want to say an old friend, but a friend I've known for a while. Okay, so what are we talking about? Well, first of all, I want to talk to you about brain pathways, and I want to talk about why we seem to fail at doing what we know is right. So, for example, if I told you that it's not a good idea to eat a bag of potato chips at 8 o'clock tonight, you would say Rutledge is worthless because you already know that. You don't need to have me explain it to you. So maybe we should just hang up. But here's the funny thing that people don't think about, or they misunderstand or misconstrue. So when someone knows, for example, a bag of potato chips and ice cream, a pint of Ben & Jerry's is not really good for them, and they violate that basic principle, they harm themselves, they know they harm themselves, then what's the explanation for that? In other words, why would you do something that hurts you? I'm going to cross the street here, so hang on one second. Oh, I thought I'd show you my new boat I get from talking to people online for free. So you see that giant cabin cruiser? That's my boat. That's where I spend my evenings and weekends. Not really. So now I'm at the Embarcadero. This is the walkway down along the harbor. It's absolutely beautiful. It's a little overcast this morning, and on the other side of the water is the Navy base, and you can see aircraft carriers and derricks and things like that for managing the fleet. Okay, so all right, we're back. So we're talking about this disconnect. Why is it that we understand we shouldn't eat a pint of Ben & Jerry's at 8 o'clock at night? Guilty. And yet, we know we shouldn't, and yet we do it. And it doesn't have to be Ben & Jerry's. It could be a leftover large pizza, which I ate the whole pizza, or something like that. What's going on there? So a lot of people will be raising their hands and, oh, I know what it is. It's willpower, right? So if you had willpower, strong willpower, then you wouldn't do that. And if you don't have the strong willpower, it means you're weak. So then people get criticized, they look down on you. They say, if you're heavy, that means you're basically weak. You're bad, weak. We Americans like to think we're strong, we're tough. And then we have people who are overweight, and we understand they shouldn't eat junk food. Frequently they are eating junk food. So the simple conclusion is weakness. They lack willpower. So we're going to talk a little bit about that this morning, and that idea kind of denigrates people. Then you have to say, these are like criminals. They know what is right, and they don't do what is right. So if that's the truth, then that means all of you who are heavy are bad. And anybody who's thin, or like me, thin-ish, we're good. But if you know people, there are plenty of bad thin people and good people who are heavy. So then what we'd like to talk about this morning is to explain that on a physiology basis, on the nerves in your brain basis, okay? So that's our plan this morning. So I'd like to talk to you about a chemical which is called dopamine. And dope, in this case, relates not to somebody who's foolish, but to narcotics and other chemicals, which, as you know, are very addictive. And right now we are in the midst, actually, of a narcotics overdose and addiction crisis. And it's interesting that narcotics crisis is kind of, in part, maybe related to our obesity diabetes crisis as well. So we're going to talk about that. But exactly how do people get addicted? What's going on in the brain? Is it the same thing that we just talked about? People know narcotics are bad. Morphine, heroin, drugs like that. They know they are bad, yet in many cases they continue to take them. Even in my case as a trauma surgeon, I used to see this all the time, where people would up to and include losing their lives to get narcotics. So I recall very vividly a man who was drunk driving, so alcohol addiction instead of narcotic addiction. He was in a crash because he was drunk driving. He killed his wife and a little girl. In addition, I had to cut off his leg. And he spent several weeks in the ICU getting better. And when he got ready to go home, I discussed with him, I said, I guess you're going to want some help getting off the alcohol. And instead of saying, yes, I see what a tragedy alcohol has been in my life, he said, well, I think I'm just going to cut back from whiskey to beer, which is a sad comedy. But essentially what I say, the reason I bring it up is his mind could not make the decision to give up a deadly substance. And so what's happened is, with a lot of research, we understand a little bit more about what's happening in the brain. And when we talk about narcotics, we're going to bring it back around to studies in the brain of people who are overweight. So, dopamine is a chemical. It's a small molecule, and what they found is the high, the hit, the buzz, the dose of sudden extreme pleasure comes from narcotics and alcohol, nicotine, and other similar drugs, goes through a pathway in the frontal cortex, and when it is lit up by a drug, the animal and the person describes it as intense pleasure. So in an animal, if you give that animal narcotics, you can see the dopaminergic pathway actually light up. So now we can do what's called functional magnetic imaging, and we can watch different parts of the brain light up. And so if we give narcotics, for example, to a little mouse, his brain will light up along the dopaminergic pathway. We know the dopaminergic pathway because we can take the brain out, we can stain it for receptors for dopamine, and they light up so we can see the nerves. We know what's going on in the brain of a mouse, and we also know now what's going on in the brain of us as humans. So what we know clearly, this is without doubt, is that when you give an animal a narcotic, a particular pathway lights up. And we know about this pathway because we know what animals will do to get that feeling. And they will do anything, including killing themselves by taking shocks, by swimming in cold water, by fighting with others until death. They want this. This is a craving so deep and so powerful, it kills or will kill. So we know this pathway gives a tremendous burst of pleasure, and it's a specific kind of pleasure too, because we also know about another pathway that we won't be talking about today. It's a pleasure pathway that's mediated by a different chemical. This chemical is called serotonin, and serotonin goes up not with narcotics, but it goes up with love. So, this seems pretty far afield from obesity, but stay with me. So serotonin goes up, and we can watch it go up in people and in mice. For example, if you show a mother a picture of her daughter or her child, and that's not dopamine, that's serotonin. And there's something else very different about the joy, the pleasure of serotonin and the pleasure of dopamine. If you give somebody or an animal a dopamine stimulant, that is like narcotics or alcohol or nicotine in cigarettes, for example, if you give them a certain dose today and then tomorrow and the next day, their response, that is the amount of pleasure that they get, will decline over time. All right, what we're saying there is that's a word called tachyphylaxis, which is tachy is fast, and phylaxis, it deteriorates the sensation over time. And so what happens is if you give narcotics over time, or cigarettes or alcohol, you notice that people need more and more to get the same effect. And also, when you take it away, they have a profound withdrawal syndrome. Okay? They want it and need it. Okay, now let's think about that for a second. So narcotics give a tremendous burst of pleasure, a kind of pleasure that's different than, say, love, because it has a deep, desperate need, and it is linked to a variety of things in our environment that makes sense, that our evolutionary development and animals like us, mice for example, have it, and cats and rats and bats and dogs and things like that, because it's a drive. It drives us to get things and do things. And it also has a automatic damping system. Okay, and what we mean by that is that after a certain amount, it takes more and more of it to get the same effect, because you kind of filled the tank. So it's trying to let us know, And so that is important for what we're going to talk about later. So, and the serotonin system is not like that. You don't kind of run out of love feelings. So they're different. And the dopaminergic system, because of its build, has some really dangerous side effects that we'll talk about. All right. So again, excuse me one second. We now know about this neurologic system inside of us, and it is very powerful, it's very primitive, and it drives our abilities to control our decision making. So one of the unique things of narcotic addiction and alcohol addiction and addiction to cigarettes is that it's tough to control. And what that means is it's tough to quit. And then it has another component, which is it tends to need a higher and higher dose to get the same buzz, to get the same hit, to get the same feelings. You need more to get the same effect. So constantly ramping up desire to get the same effect. It drives the animal or the person to need and want more and more. So it's like a cascade constantly building as the water flows downstream, so to speak. Okay, who cares? Well, one thing is that right now, that system in the brain is destroying large portions of America. West Virginia and many other states are devastated by this narcotic addiction. And so we're not going to talk about that much more today, but we need to understand how powerful it is, how devastating it is, and how even the best people cannot control it in many cases. So they are stuck. They're fighting like tigers, and still they lose their families, they lose their lives, they lose their jobs, they commit crimes, including murder and other terrible things. And so we're talking about something serious. Now I'm just going to pause for a second, let that sink in, because now I'm going to jump to something else. Okay, we now can put a little hat on a human being or a mouse, and we can watch this neurologic effect of narcotics happen in the brain. We can watch the nerves light up. In other words, what we can do is we can see the narcotic affect the brain and the nerves in the forebrain. When we give a little mouse narcotics, we can see the brain light up. We can see the poisoning of the brain. We can watch it happen. Okay, so that's pretty amazing if you think about it. So what I'm going to tell you now is that that effect of narcotics, that effect of alcohol, that deadly effect of nicotine, such that people even with lung cancer won't quit smoking, is exactly the same as when you give an animal or a person sugar or fat or salt. In other words, every day in our daily life, we have the same impact on our dopaminergic system as if we were taking narcotics, nicotine, cocaine. All of those affect the dopaminergic pathway in exactly the same way. So, as we talked about, we know from our evaluations and our experience just reading the newspaper that there are some deadly complications of being addicted to those drugs. And we are addicted to salt, sugar, and fat. In the same way, in that they take away our ability to make our own decisions. In other words, think of this. When we go into the grocery store, into the 7-Eleven, into stores all over the place, even electronic stores, there is on the way out usually a rack of salt, sugar, and fat, which are as addicting, according to the neurologic tests in animals and people, that is as addicting as narcotics, nicotine, alcohol. But now the next step is the companies that sell these foods know this. Okay? In other words, for example, McDonald's, as you may be surprised to find out, doesn't get paid if you're healthy. Their simple method of getting paid is if they sell you food. And what happens afterwards is up to you, and they don't care about it. Or if they care, they don't care enough to actually sell healthy food. Now let's think about this. So maybe the company, McDonald's for example, or Coca-Cola, or Doritos chips, isn't actually actively evil. But they are selling us narcotics. And those narcotics change our behavior. This has been well studied. And it changes their behavior as well, because they make their food specifically to meet what's called a bliss point. And what that means is, let's give an example. So the company that makes Doritos presumably makes a Dorito chip. When it starts, it's just a flat piece of basically fried bread. Okay? They take people into the laboratory and they say, how do you like these? And they eat, say, 3 on average. Then they take it back, they make the same recipe of fried bread, and they add some salt. And they count the number of chips and say it went from 3 to 5. They add a little more salt, goes to 7, goes to 8, goes a little more salt, goes to 9, go to 10. And if they go a little more salt, it goes back down to 7. So what they do in experimental laboratory, just like they were treating mice, they build a chip, a Doritos chip, that's designed to addict you to the chip, to affect the same system, the dopaminergic pathway, that makes you decide to take more narcotics, to smoke another cigarette, or to drink another beer. But they're not done there, because the next thing they do is they add to the chip some fat, some oil, something like that. And they add a teaspoon to the bit mix, or 2 or 3. And again, they watch that curve until they peak. And then there's too much grease in it, and then people don't want it anymore. Okay? Now they've got their peaks of salt and fat, and they add sugar. Salt, sugar, and fat, as we said, are equally as addictive as cocaine. In fact, in one study in animals, cocaine was not as addictive as sugar. So we're talking about powerful drugs that are in our foods. They are addicting. And when you have addiction, you have the opportunity to be overwhelmed by the addiction so that you don't make rational, healthy, normal, good decisions. You make bad decisions. And here's the other really wild thing. The companies, the drug company that sells the food, the drink, and the other things that we are enticed to eat, they know it. They design it. And then on top of that, they flaunt it in our face on the package of Doritos, and they say, I bet you can't eat just one. Yeah, hello? Yes, of course they know it. They gotcha. You're an addict, and they're everywhere in our society. It's like we have drug dealers on every corner. And so it's not surprising, even though many of us have different flavors of brain connections and things like that, that many of us become addicted. We're addicted to salt, sugar, and fat. So we can say not salt, sugar, and fat. We can say donuts and chips and French fries and McDonald's hamburgers and strawberry shakes. All those things are primarily poisonous and damaging because they get us to eat more calories than we would if they weren't filled with addictive chemicals. Okay, so I could stop there for this morning and say basically you're out of luck. But there is a good part, but we have to stop and spend some more time here and just realize the landscape of where you live. There's a drug dealer in every store that you go into. There's a drug dealer in every grocery store, every 7-Eleven, every movie theater. Every place you go, there's drug addiction. Drug addiction, and the drug addiction requires that you constantly increase the intake. And so around the world, as these drug pushers have infiltrated countries like I have been to India, I've been to Egypt, to the Middle East, to Australia and other places, those drug dealers are everywhere. And with their arrival in each country, along with it comes obesity, diabetes, heart attack, stroke, and death. We are looking at pushers killing us. So it's a rough go. You're in trouble if you want to go against this flow. How's that for a good morning? All right. So what can be done? Well, I'm going to stop talking about that for a few minutes, and I'm going to go ahead and talk to you about another topic. The whole rest of your body, the whole system, is a complex system with a variety of different weights and measures that control how much you eat and how you eat. And the dopaminergic pathway is extremely powerful, but it's interesting in that there's a little puppy dog running by, so sorry. He's cute as a button. So this system in your body is complex, and what we'd like to do now is give you a tool for how to fight. Okay? So we have to talk about some more things, and I'd like to talk to you about a new $10,000 drug. Just approved after several 5-year studies, controlled prospective trials. If you take an injection of a drug called a GLP1 agonist, that's a glucagon-like peptide 1 agonist. It works like GLP1. That is, when more GLP1 is put in your system by a needle once a week for a year, you lose about 15% of your body weight. Cool? Yeah. Okay, so you can get that, and everybody who's listening, maybe you're a candidate. You know, you could go ahead and get some of the Ozpic or Trulicity or the other versions of GLP-1 drugs, and you could take it right now. The retail cost in the United States is around $10,000, or if you go buy it in Mexico, you could get it for $5,000 a year. And the interesting thing is, in the studies, as soon as they stopped it, they gained their weight back. So just a little $10,000 a year for, say, the next 10 years. Let's see, what's 10 times $10,000? So I was thinking of doing that because, you know, I have an extra $100,000 laying around. But if, let's suppose you don't want to spend $100,000. And on the other hand, if you're diabetic, and right now you could potentially get a prescription because it's an anti-diabetic drug as well. And it might be worth having your insurance company pay for it and get a loss of 15% of your body weight, or 15 pounds for every 100 pounds you weigh. So that's the rough number for the drug. Okay, now let's think a little bit more. We know then from this that affecting GLP-1 can help with weight loss, because presumably all these people were also exposed to the dopaminergic pathways of salt, sugar, and fat. So I'm going to give you a tip this morning and then stop. There's a lot more to talk about on this subject, but I'll finish up now with a little tip, and then maybe I'll look and see if there are any questions. What if you could get GLP1 in your system for free at breakfast? In other words, I'm going to give you a tip. A $10,000 value for free at breakfast every morning. And you don't have to stick yourself with a needle. How's that? Yeah, pretty cool. All right. I'm walking up the steps here. I'll show you my steps that I'm walking up. And here's the harbor. And these are the steps I just came up while I was talking. And there's the bridge over to Coronado Island. Pretty beautiful. Okay, back to work. Oh, Holly already said it. She said oatmeal. Right, but let's go back and explain a little bit. So what we would like is help fighting this battle. What could we do? Is there any way to take on the drug addiction? Well, there's a lot of things to talk about. First of all, I think it's important to know that it is drug addiction, and that means it's a tough fight. Because it turns out that the way that drug addiction works is kind of interesting. So, before we get to talking about oatmeal, I want to talk to you about the brain of a snake. What? Okay. In other words, how is it that drug addiction actually works? How is it that our desire is mediated? What happens in the brain? And is there a way, if we understand it with skill, that we can be more effective in battling it? So again, we go back to the paradox of asking ourselves, we know that it's bad to eat junk food, yet we can't stop it. And we know it's an addictive drive, but not everybody who's tempted by addiction is taking drugs. And so we might wonder, is there a mechanism to understand how we can fight back?
On the other hand,
and so I'd like to talk to you about the brain of a snake or a lizard in your brain and how we differ. Or at least how most of us differ from a snake or a lizard. Although I've met some people, oh well, never mind.
And they're good for you. If you eat those,
all right, look here, this is the harbor.
Diabetes, less heart attack, less stroke, less dementia.
How about that bridge?
And all of these things work together.
And there's some
to make you
people in little boats out doing some fishing.
If you want to taste
and that's one of my other boats over there, that big yacht.
Add blueberries.
Okay, so I want to talk about your brain and the brain of a snake, the brain of a lizard, and explain we know a little bit more about it. We know about the dopaminergic pathway, but we also know about how your body and how your brain work together. And I'd like to show you that, for example, we know that a lot of stuff is going on in your brain.
This is healthy. This makes your
and one thing, for example, is if you're listening now and I'm talking now, we can actually, with functional MRI scanning, we can watch what part of the brain lights up to do the work of talking and listening. And it's mostly the outer coating. That's the white, wrinkled cortex of the brain. That white outer cortex of the brain does the work of talking and listening, and other parts of the brain do other things. And I'm not going to go through a lot of them, but I'm going to talk about another part of the brain, which is called the amygdala. The amygdala is shaped about like a clenched fist, and it sits beneath the gray and white matter as about the size of a clenched fist at the top of the spinal cord. So it's basic because it's been around since there were mammals and before. And it turns out it's got a big job, which is, for example, running things that we don't pay attention to. In other words, it's in charge. So for example, I can show you the amygdala and its feature of being in charge by simply asking you to hold your breath. So if I say, hold your breath for 10 seconds, you could probably do that. So everybody pretend that you're listening to me and hold your breath for 10 seconds. Okay, no problem. You're the boss. You're the captain of the ship. The person, the human being that I'm talking to, that's the person who runs things. You're the captain. If you say raise your right arm, you raise your right arm. If you say walk, you walk. If you say sit down, sit down. If you say be nice to somebody, you're nice to somebody. If you say a lot of things, you're under control. And you can hold your breath. But what if I told you to hold your breath for 10 minutes? Not going to happen. How is it? How is it that that's not going to happen? Exactly what is the mechanism of not going to happen? Well, it turns out that the amygdala has a highly accurate sensor of oxygen and carbon dioxide, precise down to a few millimeters of mercury. It can tell exactly how much oxygen and carbon dioxide are in the body, and it will take over at certain points. So it lets you think you're in charge.
Don't show me the drug.
Doesn't come up and talk to you or anything like that. But when you start to struggle holding your breath and you can't hold your breath anymore, that's the amygdala saying, I'm going to come and take over.
That's drug addiction.
That primitive part of the brain is always the winner.
The good news is
we are built so if we could, for example, hold our breath for 10 minutes, we don't contribute much to the rest
It won't be easy. But getting over drug addiction is a triumph that will make
of the animals that come after us. The evolution stops with those people who can stop their breathing.
There are narcotics in your food.
Because they die.
What I'm trying to say is there are narcotics
it turns out
in your food.
That the amygdala built into us is this power such that it takes over when we think we're in charge and it's in charge. Okay.
Alcohol.
And what that means is the amygdala is built in, and if we argue with the amygdala, we always lose.
In this moment,
anytime you go up against the amygdala, you're always going to lose.
Make a new commitment today.
And the amygdala not only monitors oxygen and carbon dioxide, it monitors calories.
You can get better.
Yeah.
It's not easy to quit cocaine.
Now, so what we're saying is really simple, is that whatever you eat,
or cigarettes,
usually you don't think about it. Usually you're not accurately and precisely measuring calories when you sit down to eat. You eat and then stop. And sometimes you think about it, but even when you think about it, usually you're overridden by the amygdala.
Period. We're all in it together. We're all surrounded, swimming in narcotics.
So what we would like to do is we would like to have the amygdala a little bit more on our side.
But we're all in this fight together.
How can we get the amygdala more on our side? Well, there are a variety of hormones, GLP1, PYY, and others that affect the
2-week time period.
amygdala. Plus, there's something unique about the amygdala, which is we just showed you, you can hold your breath for 10 seconds, you cannot hold your breath for 10 minutes. So what that means is the technique for you to be successful in working with the amygdala is to learn how he works. And I use the masculine pronoun because he's a classic nasty old caveman. And you don't dare go against him because you always lose. So what we have to do is work around him. That's what we're going to talk about next.
To be better.
Okay. So now we're going to talk to them and talk to you about oatmeal. And we'll start off by reminding you a little bit about the plants and animals in our earth.
Turn away from salty snacks.
All life-ish, except for fungi and a few other things, viruses. All life is kind of either in two classes. It's either animals, which have a certain kind of cell and a cell coating called the cell membrane, and plants, which have a different kind of outer coating called the cell wall.
Period.
And the cell wall is actually wood. It's cellulose. It's the cell wall. It's tough and different from the material that makes up meat. So that difference is critical because, as everyone knows, you can't digest and eat wood. You know, you don't go down to the Home Depot and say, give me a 2x4 because I want to have dinner. You are not a cow. You don't have the 4 stomachs and you cannot eat wood. All right, we understand that. But turns out wood is pretty good. All right, so let's understand how that actually works. When you eat wood, there's a whole bunch of things we can talk about, but we want to explain something that you should look into called the microbiome. The microbiome is new research, not that new, but new to most people that I talk to, which is all the bugs and bacteria and things that live inside your gut, your small bowel, and your colon. And it turns out we can have good bacteria and we can have bad bacteria. Good bacteria make us happy and healthy, and bad bacteria make us sick and sad and increase the risk of colon cancer, heart attack, and stroke. Guess which foods grow which bacteria? I know, you know, I'm already biased. I'm biased because of this research, and the research shows unequivocally, without any question, meat, dairy, and eggs grow the bad bacteria. Whole long lecture, not going to go into it today, but if you eat meat, dairy, and eggs, bad, evil, killer bacteria grow inside you. Conversely, if you eat plants, not Pop-Tarts. Okay, so we need to stop for a second and say, you know, a donut is plants, right? A donut does not grow healthy bacteria. A donut is highly processed. So when I'm talking to patients, I review this issue. What I want to say is really simple, which is that think of the plant itself, a wheat or oats or rye or whatever. If you think of amber waves of grain, you know, that is a plant. Once you've ground it up, bleached it, and turned it into white flour, it's now a chemical. It's not my decision, but one is good and one is poison. Okay? So it turns out that a lot of breakfast cereal, which claim health because they're plants, are actually poisonous. So a donut is, in most cases, not meat or dairy or eggs, although sometimes they can have that in there. They're poisonous because they're highly processed foods. There's lots of good research on that. But for now, we're going to be talking about less processed or minimally processed or unprocessed foods. And the reason we're talking about that is because fiber is magic. And later in our talk this morning, I'm going to talk about beans, which also have high amounts of fiber. And so sometime in the next few minutes, I'm going to mention the phrase magic beans. And if there's a beanstalk and a giant involved, I think you should turn it off. So this is the port where we get a lot of the stuff from China coming in. You can see the container ship there. Okay, so let's go back. What are we talking about? We know we're in a battle. We know that we're in a fight. We know that the drug companies, that is McDonald's and Coca-Cola, are trying to get us to eat more junk food, and we are at risk of addiction. And in fact, many of us are already addicted. And we know that the addiction affects the amygdala. And so the amygdala then makes us sick because it has been addicted. And it is more powerful than us. So what can we do? What's our way out? Well, we know that that drug, Trulicity, Ozpic, and other ones, can help by affecting the hormone called GLP1. And I brought up, and it's already been brought up in the discussion chain, I brought up oatmeal and fiber. So let's go through the magic of how we can get a mechanism of fighting amygdala and addiction and the drug addict makers who sell us drugs so they can make money. Let's figure out how we can make this work for us. Ready, set? Everybody's talking about how to cook oatmeal. Hey, pay attention. All right. So, when you eat fiber-filled foods, unprocessed foods, because a lot of the processing takes out the fiber. Now, a new trick is they grind out the fiber and then just dump fiber back in, and fiber pills and fiber just dumped back in don't work. You need the unprocessed food. We'll talk more about that some other day. But what we want to do then is, can we use this fiber, and how will it work to help us fight the addiction? Well, here's the deal. When you eat fiber, initially it's non-digestible. You can't digest it. Then it goes down over the next several hours to reach the colon, where initially if there's bad bacteria, then nothing happens, because the good bacteria need to grow in there so that you can be able to digest it. But over time, as you begin to eat more and more healthy, gradually more good bacteria will grow. And with more and more good bacteria, then you will begin to be able to digest the fiber. Now, when you have fiber go down into the gut and you have healthy bacteria, then the healthy bacteria, the good fiber-eating bacteria, chew up the fiber. They digest it just like you would digest food. Here's the cool thing. Once the bacteria digest it, they poop out the digestion products. Okay, so you eat fiber, you can't digest it, goes down to the colon, the good bacteria grow in there, they begin to take the fiber, they digest it, so you give them food, then they digest it and poop out what are called, and write this down and look it up in Google, short-chain fatty acids, okay, SCFAs. The most common short-chain fatty acids are butyrate and, forgot the other one. Anyways, the two common, propionate, sorry. I'm crossing the street and I don't want to be killed by an oncoming car. So butyrate and propionate are small chemicals. They're about the size of an acetic acid molecule in vinegar. And they diffuse directly through the lining of the colon. When they go through the lining of the colon, they release into the bloodstream. They attack L cells in the colon, and that effect goes to the brain, and they release GLP1. They release the $10,000 chemical GLP1. Oatmeal releases GLP1, and they help you fight the amygdala. Oatmeal. And it takes time for the fiber to get to the colon. And when does most of the cravings occur? Remember, you can usually fight your cravings in the morning because you can usually hold your breath for 10 seconds. But as time goes on during the day, especially if you think you're clever and skip breakfast, gradually the amygdala wakes up because you're trying to hold your breath, and then around 8 o'clock, many of my patients, that's when they break down. They suddenly go out and see what's in the cupboard, and they get Doritos and marshmallows and cookies and junk food, and that's just like holding your breath. You just can't hold your breath for that long, and so they break down. But if you eat the oatmeal for breakfast, then that fiber is going down below. It increases your ability to resist the drug addiction. Beautiful. And it works on the same hormone that Ozpic does for $10,000 a year. Plus, it also affects PYY, which is another anti-hunger hormone. Now, there's much more to it than that. Obviously, I've talked for a long time, and hope people will get a chance to read and listen to this further. But I just turned the corner. I'm heading back to my hotel. And if anybody wants to ask questions or bring anything else up, I'd be happy to take your questions really offline. And we have a busy WhatsApp group now that's very busy, given the small
really
number
proud
of people.
of
It's
you.
only, I think, 146
If it costs
or 150
$15 to
people,
get off addiction,
and they're generating
it's
questions
cheap.
like every minute. So
The amount you'll save eating
you're
cheap,
welcome to post
fresh, healthy
questions
food
there,
compared to buying
and
meat,
you're also
cheese, and milk
welcome to post questions
is going to
here
make
on
up for
Facebook.
that $15 in no time.
That's a little introduction.
Plus, you can give it to
and
somebody
I hope
you don't like.
You guys have had a good
Period.
listen, and don't hesitate to contact me if I can help. There was a person this morning who was saying she's already done all this and it didn't work, and I would say when I consult people over the past year and a half, I've talked to right now about 350 people. When I help people modify their diet and exercise plan, I would say, as far as I'm aware, almost everybody has had good results. So if you want a full online 1-hour consultation, don't hesitate to call me, because I'm still learning about this as well. So thanks again, and
You go,
I'll see
girl.
you. Goodbye.